Hello and welcome to this CNBC Africa special broadcast. I'm Chris Bishop, Head of Programming, and joining me and my guest host is CNBC Africa's Market Editor for West Africa, Kenneth Igbomor. Thank you very much for joining us on this one. On the show today, we discuss the Africa Investment Forum that will be going on throughout the week, a multi-stakeholder platform and transactional marketplace dedicated to channeling global investment into African projects. Now, joining us for this conversation is none other than the man behind it all, the president of the African Development Bank, Akinwumi Adesina. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, Chris.
And just start off with, the number of times I've heard in the run-up to this conference, it's going to be short on talk, big on deals. How far is that likely to be true?
Absolutely, that's going to be the case. You know, I think at the end of the day, what we put together is a totally 100% transactional platform that allows us to bring project promoters and also investors together in an open marketplace where they're going to be in boardroom conversations. And as we speak, we have a total of about 303 transactions and deals that are on the table for a total of $208.8 billion. And you're going to have conversations around 61 of those in boardroom conversations with investors for a total amount of $40.4 billion. So it's huge. That's what we do. And I think three things also mark this particular platform very different. First is that we are helping to develop bankable projects. Second is that we have a platform in which multiple stakeholders like ourselves, the World Bank, IFC, Afri-Exim, and several other African finance institutions are there to essentially de-risk projects. I think that's very, very important. And the third part, of course, is at the end of the day, investments have to grow somewhere. They have to land in a place and they have to grow. So the governments are very critical. So we're bringing together the private sector, the investors, and the governments, and of course the rest of us to help to de-risk and make sure things work. So we're ready to go.
All right, so I'd like you to speak to how you plan to bridge that gap between the available capital, globally and even locally, with the bankable projects.
Well, if we take a look at the amount of infrastructure gap that Africa itself has, we did an own estimate at the African Development Bank is anything between $68 billion to $108 billion a year. Well, I'm not scared of those numbers because I know that the money is out there. Let me tell you why. First and foremost, take the whole issue of the global pension funds and sovereign wealth funds. Okay, you have total assets under management today of roughly $56 trillion, right? And for us at the African Development Bank, if we're talking about spending $170 billion a year, that's just 0.32% of the total assets under management of the global pension funds and sovereign wealth funds. So we want to make sure that we actually can tap into that, and that's one of the things that we are doing. Secondly, is that charity must begin at home. Africa itself has pension funds and sovereign wealth funds of total right now of roughly about $622 billion. And so which means we can probably take about 26, 27% of that, and then we can close a lot of this infrastructure gap. We can't keep talking about it. So the point I'm trying to make is that foreign direct investments is important. Domestic capital formation, leveraging the capital markets is very, very important. And to do that is exactly why you need this platform, which is a platform to allow investments to land in a very smooth way that you can de-risk it and therefore make those that will not probably want to invest in Africa invest by landing their investment on a smooth landing strip.
So the world is a very uncertain and scary place, unfortunately, at the moment. There is a reason there's a lot of money sitting in capital funds not doing very much at the moment. How are you going to convince people to start putting this capital out after so many difficult years?
Well, first and foremost is we've got to change the image, the perception of Africa. This is as much as about changing the perception as much as how you create an investment. For too long, Africa is seen as a development destination. I don't want Africa to be seen as a development destination. I want Africa to be seen as an investment destination. That's the lenses which we look at the continent must be different. And I don't think Africa should beg for development. I think if we invest properly, if we have to do the right things in terms of right projects, good policies, good regulatory environment, the investors quite naturally will come. If you take, Chris, at the issue of energy, the amount of energy deficit that Africa has today, will require investing about roughly another $30 billion a year. Okay, but that's how you look at it, whether it's the cup is half full or half empty. I see it as half full. So which means that you should turn it into the $30 billion annual investment opportunity that people will have for renewable energy, for whether it is hydro, whether it's solar, and things like that. So since the deficits are quite high in Africa, it means that the rate of return on investments are actually quite higher in Africa than anywhere else. So the critical thing, to your point, is how do you therefore attract the capital, make it patient capital that can stand in Africa, and give the comfort for investors to be in Africa. That's what we are really trying to do with this Africa Investment Forum. I want us to be able to create, it's like planting seed. You plant the seed, you dig up the hole, and you put a fertilizer there. You want to make sure the plant grows and you get watered. That's why we're doing this Africa Investment Forum. It's not an event. It's a platform that's going to be a permanent platform in which investors can have the confidence they can bring their investments and make sure it's be landing smoothly. I emphasize again, in Africa.
All right, then I'd like to look at the pipeline of projects that you have, in this forum, and what priority areas are you looking at?
Well, obviously we're going to look at areas that Africa's priorities are going to be. For the $208.8 billion of pipeline of projects that have been prepared, they're actually in infrastructure. You look at transport and utilities. There's quite a significant part of them there. Agriculture, of course, I'm big on agriculture for Africa, food and ag business for Africa. It's there. But we also have manufacturing. It's a very good component of that. These are the major areas. Energy, of course, I must say, top on it, really top on it. These are the areas in which you see most of the transactions.
So when you talked about planting seeds there, I thought there speaks a former Minister of Agriculture. But in planting these seeds, you say you're going to de-risk investments for people. It sounds a brilliant idea, but surely it's not going to be that easy, is it, at these difficult times?
Well, what we've done that's very unique is the fact that, for us as a multilateral development finance institution, we do risk all the time. The world is not, people shouldn't say, I can't invest because of risk. Well, look, the very fact that you walk across the street is a risk. You drive a car is a risk. We all take risk every single day. It's about your risk return that actually matters. And so what we're trying to do is that let's have the projects that clearly show what the high returns will be. What are the risk profiles that you're looking at as investors? What part of that is actually real risks, measurable, tangible risk? What part of that is perceived risk, in which people say if something blows up in one country, I think 54 countries are blowing up in Africa. So we've got to be able to segment those. But we have the instruments. The bank, the African Development Bank, we have partial risk guarantee instruments that we use all the time to support investments in which the government may not meet its own obligation to private sector. We also have partial credit guarantee instruments that allows us to have private sector to private sector transactions in which, the counterparties have to make sure their obligations are not met, somebody pays for it. We use this instrument so well, and we leverage so much from this instrument. So what is unique now is that the African Development Bank and the other partners, we're now saying, okay, let's pull all our instruments together. Is it market risk? Is it financial risk? Is it project risk? Is it political risk? We can pull all, mutualize, if you wish, a risk-sharing instrument and scale so that we can de-risk projects at scale. It's the first time, I must say, Chris, that this is happening in any part of the world. We have ourselves, we have the World Bank, we have the International Finance Corporation, we have the European Investment Bank, European Development, EBRD. We also have Afri-Exim Bank, we have Africa 50, we have DBSA, we have, all the big players, and we all come in together and say, well, look, let's just deliver as one by mutualizing our instruments to be able to advance transactions in Africa. That's what we're there for.
All right, then I'd like you to speak to how, the African Investment Forum is going to tie in with the high-five strategy of the African Development Bank, especially with this year's theme from the annual meetings, which is accelerating Africa's industrialization.
Yeah, absolutely. I get quite concerned about industrialization on the continent because the share of manufacturing GDP has been going down. I think Africa is actually deindustrializing because it is not addressing some of the structural issues. Some of those big issues still are the same. Kenneth, it's still energy. So as I mentioned to you, a lot of the transactions will be on energy, will be also on infrastructure, which is actually much badly needed. If you're going to be doing the Continental Free Trade Area, hopefully everybody's going to sign on to it and so on. It's going to change, a game changer for the continent. But you need infrastructure, you need ports, you need rails, you need transnational highways to connect. So a lot of the transactions we're really talking about are the things that will advance the high five agenda strategy of the bank. I just think that the time has come for us to think differently. Countries, yes, can go to the market, and many of them Euro bonds, and that's fine. We can talk about the yields they get and all of those things. But I think that we've got to start looking at how do we get these institutional investors, these pools of money, to be able to help to advance these critical areas.
So going back to your promise when you came up with the idea of this conference, deals, deals, deals. I just want to say I've covered scores of these conferences up and down the continent, and often tangible results can be hard to find. What are you going to do differently at this conference to try to get people sitting down with a pen in one hand and a contract in the other? What are you going to try and do?
What we've done is, this is not a show and tell event. This is because to actually do projects, you got to be serious with it. We've been working on this for the last several months, developing pipelines of projects that are standardized. We've developed, digitized way of connecting the investors and with the project promoters, and to the stage where they can carry these things into the boardroom conversations. And what is so unique about it is that, suppose you and I sign a contract today and say we're going to do this. What if the policy environment changes in the country, right? And so what happens? And so we're looking at the full transaction chain, and we're having in the same boardroom heads of state of the countries that are concerned to say, well, look, we're concerned about 1, 2, 3, 4. If you kick those things out of the table, this will actually happen. So I think we are very advanced in many of these things, and I'm delighted that we can provide the opportunity and the avenue for this to go on. And I must also add that one thing we are doing also is that many of these things got to be actually very transparent. The fact that we are leading this, brings a lot of transparency, accountability, right? Fairness to the deal, so that you're not signing off something that you shouldn't be signing up. Get smart. And so we bring our own knowledge to that to make sure that the countries and the private sector are actually having a symmetrical conversation on deals, not an asymmetric conversation on deals.
All right, so as things kick off tomorrow, I would like to know for you what you think are the exciting highlights people should look out for.
Well, I think first and foremost is that you will find a platform in which our heads of state are interacting almost like CEOs, and that is an exciting thing to have in this boardroom conversation. Secondly, is that you see a lot of very serious conversations, investment conversation around projects and deals that have been prepared over a reasonably good period of time that are, you can move from rare to, medium to well done. I like my steak well done. So some of them are really going to be well done, and then they'll be ready to hit the ground going. And so I'm very excited about it. I think everybody's here from around the world, and so I think it's going to be quite exciting.
Well, Mr. Adesina, before we end this interview, we're going to ask you to nail your colours to the mast and say what your target is. But before we get there, what kind of signals have you had ahead of this conference from the foreign investment community that they're prepared to come and put their money where their mouth is?
Well, I think when we started, we were not sure how many were going to show up. We are oversubscribed. All the boardroom investment conversations globally are oversubscribed. Unfortunately, we have to, not all the people that can attend can actually be in those boardroom conversations. We have had, almost 365 investors that are going to be in this boardroom conversations. 92% of those boardroom conversations are oversubscribed. And so that tells you what the interest is. And what I think this platform really offers is that we offer an intermediation. We drastically cut down the search cost for people looking for bankable deal. We actually also help to standardize things, so it's easier for you to have those conversations. Those things you never used to have in Africa, and that's our role. Our role is to always make sure that the right things are done. They are done in an environment that could make investments to thrive. I actually firmly believe, I'm not asking for aid, right, for Africa. I'm actually asking for investments. And I think for investments, capital doesn't like to be made nervous. And so we just have to make sure we do the right things to attract the investments to Africa. I'm confident that we can get that.
All right, I'll go back to the sectors again. I want to look at power. By how much do you think this forum will help solve the challenges for power in Africa?
I think significantly. I think, we've got my guy, my vice president, Amadou Hart, is doing a fantastic job in that. If you take the case of South Africa, where we are here, from the perspective of the African Development Bank, we're going to be investing an additional $1.3 billion over the next 2 years in South Africa. Most of that, of course, will go through our board. Most of that is going to be in the energy sector. If you take the Medupi project, power project, which we want to help to advance, we've already invested a couple of billions of dollars in the Medupi project. It's 2,638 megawatts. But we think that we need to help Medupi to retrofit some of the technologies to be more compliant with the environmental issues that we face, because they're in that area. We are also going to be investing quite a lot in transmission. Our board of directors just approved in September a total of $218 million to help ESCOM with its expansion of its transmission line. And so all across Africa, whether it's solar, whether it is hydro, we're going to do that. And by the way, big issue we're working on right now is on solar. We're working on something called desert to power. Okay. Now, desert to power is a big effort we're doing to light up the entire Sahel through the power of the sun, right? It's going to be a total of 10,000 megawatts. It's going to be the world's largest solar zone, right? And so we started already in Burkina Faso with a Yelen, with the Agence Française de Développement, which is 50 megawatts. We're going to build that continuously. This is going to be one of those transformative energy projects. Africa cannot develop in the dark. We've got to fast track everything that has to do with energy. And I don't believe, by the way, in incremental energy. I believe in transformative energy.
What about going back to Nigeria, the land of your birth? Many years, well, not too long ago, a decade ago, the country was suffering from what could be politely said as a paucity of energy and electricity. What's the AfB done there to try to drive one of the biggest economy, or the biggest economy on this continent?
Yeah, my own perspective in everything that I do absolutely is that my philosophy of development is simple. If I'm not ashamed of something, I don't change it. Yeah, but if I'm ashamed of something, I'll change it. I don't think it's acceptable that Nigeria is hovering in 4,500 megawatt space. No, Nigeria ought to be in 40,000 megawatt space. That's what we should be talking about. I think that we as a bank are strongly supportive. We've been investing in Nigeria for quite some time. We've been working with the Minister of Power right now. We're working with them on the transmission company of Nigeria, in which we've invested over $200 million to help to improve the transmission line. We supported Nigerian bulk electricity trader company because they have the issues in terms of the liquidity challenges. We provided about $200 million to help them to unblock some of those things. We are also going to be investing in solar with the Minister of Power. We are looking at something in the Jigawa area, which is going to be about 1,000 megawatts of solar that we are investing in. We are also investing in other types of renewable energy projects at small scale. And by the way, as Chris, I also chair the board of Africa 50. Africa 50 is a private equity fund that is investing heavily right now in Nigeria in the energy sector. So all across the space on energy, we're going to continue to invest a lot more in Nigeria.
For me, I'd like to look at the G20 Compact with Africa. It's one of the highlights that I'm actually looking forward to. And I'd like to know what that means for you and what to look out for.
The G20 for Africa is a great initiative. I highly commend Chancellor Merkel. She's gold. Her name, as far as I'm concerned, is written in gold in Africa when it comes to development. I was with Chancellor Merkel, with President Ramaphosa and other heads of state in Berlin just last week. The Compact with Africa operates on a basic principle. Get your house in order and your guests come in, right? If the investment environment is clean, investors will come in. And I can tell you it's working. The Compact with Africa countries, if you look at them, over the last, from 2015 till now, they have made significant progress on the business, investment, regulatory environment. A total of the policies they said they're going to change regulations, 101 commitments that they made. 98 of those commitments are well on track. That is remarkable, right? And you have them since 2015. They've attracted about $150 billion of investments. I was in Berlin and I saw new investment in power, in other infrastructure in the countries, including South Africa, by the way, that are doing the right thing. So the thing I want to say that excites me with Compact with Africa is that reforms take time. Reforms are hard. That's why most people don't like to do them. It's like pulling teeth. But when reforms work, the benefits can be tremendous. And I think that's what you have with the Compact with Africa. And for this Africa Investment Forum, there's actually a big session that we've organized with G20 and with the European Union on the Compact with Africa, with several ministers coming all across from Europe to advance private sector investments in Compact with Africa countries.
And what about, we've talked a lot about investors here, what about the political will? I mean, you need political will, you need the leaders of this continent behind you to open up to the investment of the world. How concerned or otherwise are you about the leaders of this continent following your lead, shall we say?
You know, I think that our leaders are doing the right things. I am proud of Africa. I'm proud of the fact that over the last, if you look at it, 2016 till now, Africa leads the world in terms of opening up for business. 85 of the reforms that are done globally were actually done in Africa. So that's a very good thing. I was also there in Berlin, and it was quite interesting, that conversation with Chancellor Merkel, and she was talking to the African heads of state, and Chancellor Merkel, German Chancellor, said, well, you know, if this conversation was happening 10, 15 years ago, it'd be very different from what we're having today with the leaders around the table. And I remember one of the African presidents saying, well, yeah, that's because our focus is on investment. You know, we want to really get our countries well aligned for investment. I think what you have across African countries is that Africa is so much in a hurry for development. And we recognize that governments alone are never going to do the job, right? You need the private sector. We need to open up the private sector. We need to also make sure that we have strong macroeconomics policy that makes sure that our economies are stable, make sure that people can invest in those economies, and that there is policy consistency, policy stability. You know, a government comes in today, government will come in tomorrow. That's how the world is. But it doesn't mean investors don't invest in tranches like that. They invest long term. Aliko Dangote said something that I really admire. You know, he said, if you are in a hurry, don't invest in Africa. He said, but if you want to be with patient capital, invest in Africa, because those that don't invest in Africa eventually are going to regret they did it, because this is the place to invest in. So, but it just means also that our leaders are committed to freeing up the space, you know, making sure the regulations do not preclude investors, and that we open up to also support Africa to Africa investment. It's not always just foreign direct investment. You know, it is Africa to Africa investment. And by the way, I am thrilled with some of the things I'm seeing, but I want to see greater volume. If you take out the numbers between 2006 and 2016, 2006, intra-Africa investment was only $2 billion. In 2016, it was $10 billion. This year, it's $12 billion. We want that to grow. But more exciting is companies like Dangote, Standard Chartered Bank, you have the CL companies, you have all these multinational African companies that are now investing across the border, right? Just in 2006 to 2010, the number of mergers, cross-border mergers, has increased to 418. So that tells you that Africans are believing in themselves, they are believing in their economies. We just have to continue to open up. And I think like roses have thorns, but everybody loves roses. Don't focus on the thorns. Just keep focusing on the fact that the roses keep opening up.
Anyway, I'm afraid we're running out of time, but there's a question that both Kenneth and I want to ask you badly. Yeah. What's your target in your mind, in your planning for this conference in terms of dollars and cents?
Well, you know, our target, as I say, you know, you eat your food in chunks, right? You know, so you can digest them. You know, we've broken down the $208.8 billion that we have on the platform into chunks. This conversation, boardroom conversations this year, is going to focus exclusively on the $40.4 billion of transactions that we have on the table. You know, sleeves rolled up, that's what we're working on.
Well, thank you very much indeed for your time and insights, and best of luck over the next few days. Yeah. Fred, that's where we're going to leave it on this special broadcast. Thanks to our guest, Akinwumi Adesina, the president of the African Development Bank, for joining us. We'll bring you a series of live events from the forum in the next 3 days. Keep watching CNBC Africa. We're first in business worldwide.